July 26, 1944. Lechfeld Airfield, southern Germany. Oberleutnant Hans Fey pulled back the throttle. The Me-262 screamed past 540 miles per hour, so fast the wind couldn't keep up. Behind him, P-51 Mustangs tried to close, but their bullets fell behind like stones in a stream. He grinned under his oxygen mask. They can't even touch me. Down below, wrecked cities still smoldered. Berlin, Hamburg, Cologne, graves of ash and steel. But up here, he was untouchable. They will fear us now, he muttered, and for a moment he believed it. Until the tower crackled back. Unidentified aircraft just landed. American markings, but it's one of ours. Hans blinked. What did he just say? He didn't know it yet, but the jet war was already lost. In the summer of 1943, Germany was bleeding. Allied bombers darkened the sky over Essen, Frankfurt, Munich. The Reich's heartland, once defiant, now trembled nightly under explosions that never seemed to stop. And yet, deep inside Bavaria, in the town of Augsburg, engineers worked like priests in a dying temple. They were building a machine that was not just fast, it was mythic. The Messerschmitt Mi-262. A jet fighter so advanced, some Luftwaffe pilots believed it could turn back the tide of war. Hans Fey first saw it in a hangar still damp with paint. The floor stank of grease and fear. Around the fuselage, engineers whispered. Some smoked nervously, others just stared. It didn't look like anything else. Sleek, predatory. The nose dipped low like a hawk mid-dive. Twin Junkers Jumo 04 engines curled under the wings like swollen muscles. No propeller, no roar. Just the soft hiss of pressure testing systems not yet ready for flight. Like something from the future, Hans muttered. Or from the grave, another pilot said under his breath. But Hitler didn't want a fighter. He wanted a bomber. At a meeting in Obersalzberg, surrounded by fawning officers, the Führer had pounded the table. Make it carry bombs. We will strike London in minutes. It will be the Blitz reborn. His generals nodded. No one dared say no. Not even Willy Messerschmitt, the plane's own creator. And so, what should have been a razor-sharp interceptor, designed to cut through B-17 formations like a scalpel, was weighed down by explosives and politics. The engineers tried to resist. They begged to keep it pure. Fast. Lethal. But Nazi dreams were heavier than logic. Hans trained for weeks at Lager Lechfeld. Takeoff was violent. The Jumo engines screamed like banshees. Acceleration forced your spine into the seat, and landing felt like dancing on broken glass. But once airborne, the sky split. At full throttle, the Mi-262 outran sound. Not officially, but fast enough that gunfire behind you was pointless. The aircraft could climb to 30,000 feet in minutes. Bank left, dive, engage, and vanish before Allied pilots could react. It was, in Hans' words, like becoming untouchable. Back in Berlin, Joseph Goebbels seized the myth. Propaganda reels played the Mi-262 as Germany's final miracle. Children watched wide-eyed as silver jets soared across the screen. Radios broadcast quotes, faster than light, stronger than steel, the Reich strikes back. Hans remembered the posters. A jet outlined in fire, carving an American bomber in half with a burst of cannon. Below it, a slogan, Vergeltung kommt von oben. Retribution comes from above. But there was one problem. Only a handful were ready. Germany, in 1944, had no rubber, no copper, no time. Allied bombers had already hit the Daimler-Benz factory. Junkers plants were running at a half capacity. And the Mi-262's engines, miraculous though they were, only lasted 25 hours. sometimes less. Every sortie drained the future. Still, Hans believed, they all did. The young pilots drank beer and laughed in the barracks. "Let the Yanks come," they'd say. "We'll tear the wings off their Mustangs." The Reich might have been dying. But in the belly of the jet age, a small sliver of delusion still burned, fast, bright, and fatal. August 1944. The hangars at Luftwaffe smelled different now, not of fuel, but of fear. Hans stood beside Me 262, number 1798. Its panels shimmered like steel water under morning light. But something was wrong. The right engine wouldn't start. Again. A technician crawled out from beneath the wing, grease smeared across his face. Fuel pumps fouled. Again. "How?" Hans asked. "It was replaced last week." The man shrugged. "Bad part, or maybe not an accident." Hans narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" The tech leaned in, whispered low. "Some of the laborers, they're not just tired, they're angry." The Reich had run out of men, so it turned to prisoners, conscripted labor from France, Poland, Ukraine, and from Buchenwald, Dachau. They were forced into Messerschmitt factories, into tunnels beneath the Alps, where air hung thick with mold and resentment. Some sabotaged parts on purpose. Microscopic cuts in fuel lines, loose bolts near the turbine housing. At first it was dismissed as incompetence. Then entire airframes began to vanish in fire on takeoff. Hans heard rumors. One Me 262 flamed out mid-air. The engine tore itself apart. The pilot ejected too low. His parachute never opened. Still, the orders came. Fly, fight, win. But something had changed in the silence. Hans started noticing the others. Older pilots, aces from Spain, from Poland, now walked slower. Their jokes fell flat. One refused to fly altogether. "It's suicide," he muttered. "We're flying miracles built on corpses." Then came the mission to intercept a B-17 raid over Munich. Hans lifted off, the Ma 262, roaring with pure, furious speed. But 5 minutes into the climb, he felt it, a rattle in the starboard engine. He checked the gauges, oil pressure falling, temperature rising. Then, nothing. Flame out. The aircraft dipped, wind screamed against the canopy. He banked hard, feathered the dead engine, throttled the other, limped back to base. When he landed, ground crew swarmed, pulled off the panels. And there it was, a broken cotter pin, cheap, bent, a piece that never should have passed inspection. Hans didn't say anything that night, but he sat for hours in the barracks, listening to the wind whistle through the cracked window. He stared at the ceiling and thought, "We built the fastest plane in the world, and can't even build it twice." The jet could outrun bullets, but it couldn't outrun betrayal. Not from the Allies, but from the very machines Germany used to feed its war. September 1944. The Americans were coming faster now, not just with tanks or men, but with air. Hundreds of bombers, thousands, flying fortresses that didn't stop. They hit rail lines, bridges, power plants, and they learned. They began to wait for takeoff, because that was when the Me 262 was weakest. Hans sat strapped into the cockpit, heart pounding as his jet taxied forward. There was no armor on the runway, no air cover, just naked concrete, stretching out like a noose. The Me 262's jet engines needed time, nearly 30 seconds, to reach full thrust. 30 seconds of vulnerability. 30 seconds where the fastest fighter in the world couldn't move. Above, Mustangs waited. They circled like vultures. On September 18, they pounced. Hans had just lifted his wheels, A quarter-mile into the climb, he felt the rattle of gunfire before he heard it. His canopy sparked with tracers. A Mustang dove passed him, close enough to see the pilot's face. Hans twisted the stick, slammed the throttle. The Me-262 roared to life, pulled away in a scream of altitude and smoke. He escaped. Barely. 3 others didn't. Their jets never left the ground. Fireballs lit the horizon. He watched them burn from 8,000 feet. At the debrief, General Galland was furious. The famous ace slammed a fist on the map table. "These planes are not weapons. They're targets." Someone asked for more flak batteries. Someone else suggested burying the jets in forest hangars. Hans said nothing. What was there to say? Even speed couldn't outrun strategy. The next day, the base mechanic showed Hans something. A list. It was supposed to be classified. "Spare parts, fuel allocations, engine overhauls," the man whispered. "Know what this says?" Hans scanned it. "What?" 2 working jets left, 2. And next month. The mechanic lit a cigarette, shook his head. No deliveries scheduled, not one. Back in the sky, Hans flew alone. Where there were once formations, now there were singles. Lone shadows racing high above wreckage. He intercepted a bomber group near Stuttgart, fired a 30mm burst into the lead B-17. Watched the wings shear off. The others scattered. The Mustang escorts turned, but he was already gone, streaking west like a ghost. But when Hans returned to base, he didn't feel pride, just exhaustion and a deeper kind of fear. He walked past the wrecks, burned-out Me-262s dragged to the edge of the field. One had landed with a blown tire, skidded. The pilot died instantly. Another had lost an engine on takeoff. No survivors. Every jet lost was irreplaceable. Every flight felt more like a coin toss. Hans no longer slept. He wrote in his journal, "We are flying angels with paper wings, and every mission is the last hymn." By mid-October, the skies over Germany no longer belonged to the Reich. They belonged to the endless drone of American power, not just in machines, but in numbers, fuel, rhythm, and something Hans couldn't describe yet, but would soon come to see up close. A power not of metal, but of mindset. October 1944, news filtered through the barracks like a cold wind, and Me-262 had landed in enemy hands. Not shot down, landed. The pilot, Oberfähnrich Hans Guido Mutke, had defected or made an emergency landing. No one knew. But the Americans had the plane. Hans didn't believe it at first, until the bulletin board confirmed it. Captured jet fighter under analysis at Wright Field, Ohio. Photos came weeks later. Black and white, blurry, but real. The Me-262 sitting on American tarmac, flanked by men in lab coats. One picture showed a test pilot climbing into the cockpit, grinning. Hans stared at it for a long time. Something twisted in his stomach. He had always imagined the Americans as crude, inefficient. That's what the Reich taught. Lazy mechanics, assembly line idiots. But the way they looked at the jet, not with fear, with curiosity. "They'll never understand it," one pilot scoffed. But Hans wasn't so sure. He remembered something from months ago. A Mustang pilot he'd shot at, who rolled inverted, dove, and disappeared into the clouds with impossible precision. He hadn't flown like a fool. He'd flown like a student. Then, in early November, intelligence confirmed the worst. The Americans weren't just flying the Me-262. They were improving it, adapting materials, testing engine stress limits, running wind tunnel simulations, all in weeks. Hans stood in the hangar that night, staring at his jet, silver gray under the floodlights. He reached out, ran his hand along the rivets. They'd built it with the minds of visionaries. But the Reich gave them no system, no stability, no time. Now, their miracle was a blueprint on someone else's desk. He thought of the pilot in that photograph, climbing into the Me-262 like it was just another machine to learn, break down, rebuild. They'll figure it out, Hans realized, not because they're better, but because they have the freedom to be. March 1945. Hans Fey was no longer a pilot. He was a prisoner, captured near Augsburg during the Allied advance, stripped of rank, transported west, and flown across the Atlantic in the belly of a C-47. He expected a cage, maybe a concrete camp, hard bread, blank stares. What he didn't expect was Detroit. The guards didn't say much when they offloaded him, just pointed through a tall chain-link fence at a building that stretched past what felt like the horizon. A factory. Smoke rose from smokestacks like fingers clawing the sky. The air smelled of hot oil, steel, and something oddly sweet. Chocolate from a vending stand just outside the gate. Hans squinted. It wasn't a military base. It was an engine plant. And what he saw inside shattered something in him. Rows. Hundreds of workers in clean uniforms. Women with red bandanas threading wires. Black men tuning engines with surgical precision. There was music, jazz, something upbeat, playing from a loudspeaker near the foreman's desk. The assembly line moved like a heartbeat, smooth, relentless. Hans was handed goggles, a clipboard. A translator whispered, "You're here to observe, not interfere." He walked the line in silence. One engine, then another, then another. Ford V-1650s. Merlin copies. The same heart that beat inside the P-51 Mustang. A new one rolled off the line every 57 minutes. 57 minutes, the translator repeated, seeing his expression. By tomorrow, we'll have 20 more. By next week, 140. Hans didn't respond. Back in Bavaria, it had taken 3 weeks to assemble a single Jumo 04. And half the time, it failed in testing. Here, a line of 19-year-olds built them faster than he could fly. A manager passed by. He smiled, extended his hand. "You flew the 262? Hans hesitated, nodded. The man grinned wider. "Hell of a plane. We were lucky to get one in time." Then he walked off, casual, confident, whistling, as if this was just another day in paradise. Hans stood by the loading dock, watching crates labeled U.S. Army Air Forces, Fighter Division, being rolled into trucks. Engines, landing gear, prop assemblies. Each crate marked with dates, none more than 4 days old. He remembered begging for turbine blades back in Lechfeld, waiting weeks, stealing copper from other departments. He didn't say it aloud, but in his chest, the truth cracked through. The Americans didn't win with genius. They won with rhythm, with order, with a system built on trust, not fear. And for the first time, Hans Fey, Luftwaffe ace, jet pioneer, true believer, felt something he had never let himself feel before: envy. The next morning, Hans was taken deeper into the plant. They passed rows of workers laughing over coffee, technicians swapping wrenches without barking orders. No shouting, no fear. Just motion, constant, confident, American motion. A foreman opened a door. "You'll want to see this." Inside, an observation deck with a glass wall overlooking final assembly. Hans stepped forward and froze. 12 P-51 Mustangs, lined up like silver eagles, half complete, wings raised, engines exposed, men crawling over them like ants. Then a horn sounded, music faded, shift change, new workers flowed in, fresh, clean, coordinated, like water refilling a riverbed. Hans checked his watch. 2 minutes. That's all it took to rotate an entire labor force. Back in Germany, the Me-262 plant shut down for hours if one man was late. Here, the machine never slept. One plane every 66 minutes. That was the number, the translator said. But that's not the miracle, he added. Come down, see why it works. They descended into the factory floor. Each station had printed diagrams, step by step, color-coded. Simple English. Any worker, any background, could build the Mustang, because the system trusted them to learn. Some of them, the translator whispered, started here last month. Hans blinked. That's impossible. The man shrugged. That's America. He passed a young woman inspecting ailerons. She smiled at him, polite, professional. Another man handed her a wrench. Their hands brushed. They laughed. Hans stared too long. He didn't mean to. Back home, this would have been forbidden. A white girl, a black man. But here, it was normal, efficient, equal, functional. Not perfect, but human in a way his world never allowed. At the end of the tour, Hans stood by a shipping bay. 3 brand-new Mustangs rolled out on flatbeds. Bright insignias, polished glass. A child's voice rang out from somewhere, probably a worker's son, waiting by the gates. He shouted, "Daddy, is that yours?" One of the men waved. Hans watched the plane fade into the sun. They don't build jets, he thought. They build something stronger, faith in each other. Hans couldn't sleep that night. The factory hum still echoed in his bones. Not the noise, but the rhythm. It reminded him of something. Not a battlefield, not a hangar, a hallway. Spring 1944, Messerschmitt headquarters, Augsburg. He'd waited there for hours with 4 other pilots. Engineers shuffled past with blueprints. Some looked excited. Most looked exhausted. At the end of the hall, a red door. Behind it, the meeting that changed everything. Willie Messerschmitt had begged for purity. A clean interceptor. No bombs. No compromises. Hitler wanted thunder. A fighter that cannot bomb is not a weapon. It is a toy, he'd said. So the Me-262 was changed. Wings reinforced. Hard points added. Bomb sights installed. Weight increased. It wasn't built for that. In testing, bomb loads cracked fuselage welds. Landing gear failed on touchdown. Pilots couldn't stabilize on approach. Hans had seen it all. 2 comrades died in April alone, one in a shallow dive, the other on a go-around that never made it back. Inside the jet, things were worse. The Jumo 04 was genius on paper, but in practice, it devoured itself. The turbine blades melted under heat. Bearings seized. Fuel lines vibrated loose. Every 10 hours, the engine needed overhaul. And there weren't enough mechanics. Not trained ones. Just prisoners with bleeding fingers and blank eyes. One day, Hans tried to file a maintenance request. The officer refused. "We are out of magnesium. Use standard bolts." "But standard melts under..." "I said use them." Hans did. The engine caught fire. He bailed at 200 meters, shattered his collarbone on landing. No report was filed, just another accident. Now standing in his American-issued cot, Hans saw the divide clearly. The Reich built marvels, but never systems. Every piece of progress came wrapped in politics, in paranoia, in ego. They had engineers, yes, but no feedback loop, no correction, no humility, just top-down madness. And below it all, men like Hans, flying machines too advanced for the world they were built in. He opened his journal, rode in the dark. They made us chase miracles. But the Americans, they just made it work. It was April 1945, a warm day in Ohio. Hans sat alone on a wooden bench just outside the hangar. The sun felt strange on his face. A guard approached, not brusque, not barking, just casual. He wore aviator sunglasses, chewed gum, and held 2 bottles of Coca-Cola, sweating in the heat. "You flew the jet, right?" the guard asked. Hans nodded. The American handed him a bottle. "Heard it could outrun a bullet?" Hans hesitated, took the Coke, said nothing. The guard cracked his own bottle open, sipped, then sat beside him. "They told us it was invincible," he said. "Your bird." Hans finally spoke, voice low. "It was fast." The American chuckled. "I'll bet. One of our guys said it handled like a hot knife." Hans smirked, just barely. "And it melted just as easily." They sat in silence for a moment. The factory hummed in the distance. Then the American leaned back. "You know what always gets me?" Hans looked over. "You guys had the tech, no question, but we had the vending machines." Hans furrowed his brow. "I don't understand." The American tapped the Coke bottle. This, the pause, the music in the break room, the idea that some kid from Kansas and a girl from Georgia could build a warplane together and go home after shift, eat pie, and play baseball. Hans stared at the drink in his hand. Tiny bubbles rose in slow spirals. The bottle was cold, real glass, a metal cap, not recycled tin. No stamp of rationing, no bitter aftertaste of substitute sugar. Just the quiet luxury of plenty. Back home, Coca-Cola was banned. Too American, too decadent. Here, it was served to prisoners. He took a sip. Sweet, sharp, unbelievable. Something in him broke, not from shame, not from defeat, but from the sheer simplicity of it. They had beaten him, not with speed, but with normalcy. The American stood. "You'll be heading to Texas soon. I hear there's a POW camp down there. Hotter weather, friendlier faces." He winked. "Maybe they'll teach you how to barbecue." Hans managed a tired smile. The American turned, walked away, bottle still in hand. Hans looked at the Coke again. A child's drink, a civilian thing. But in that moment, it felt like a weapon. Not because it killed, but because it endured. November 1945, Bavaria. Hans Fey stepped off the transport truck with a paper bag, a limp, and too many memories. He hadn't seen home in almost a year. What was left of it? The fields near Lechfeld were bare now. The hangars collapsed, the runways cracked, and there they were. The jets, dozens of them, Me-262s, scattered like bones across the broken airfield, some with wings snapped off, others with canopies torn open by wind and time. Not buried, not preserved, just left. He walked toward one, 1798, his old bird. The nose was dented, the paint peeled back like scabbed skin. He ran a hand along the fuselage, dry, cold, silent. No more roar, no more fear, just an empty shell. He looked inside the cockpit. The seat was torn, dials shattered, rust creeping up the rudder pedals. There was still a pencil wedged beside the throttle, the same one he'd used to mark fuel levels. He didn't pull it out, didn't have to. Around him, the sky was quiet. Not like before. No sirens, no Mustangs, no thunder. Just wind and a child's laughter. Hans turned. Near the edge of the airstrip, a boy kicked a ball, maybe 6 or 7, wearing patched clothes and no shoes. Another child chased him, and then he saw it. Clutched in the boy's arm, held tight as a treasure. A model airplane. Not a Messerschmitt, a Mustang, painted silver, blue nose, U.S. star and bar. The child flew it through the air, making engine noises with his lips. Vam! Hans watched, frozen. They had forgotten the jets, forgotten the Reich, forgotten the posters, the promises, the pride. But they remembered that plane. The one that showed up when theirs didn't. The one that came back. He sat on the tarmac as the wind picked up. The paper bag at his side rattled softly. Inside it, a change of clothes, a toothbrush, and, still unopened, a glass bottle of Coca-Cola. He hadn't touched it since Ohio, hadn't wanted to. But now, under the same sky he once ruled with fire, something inside him stirred. He reached into the bag, pulled it out, twisted the cap off. The metal hissed, the fizz bubbled. He drank, not much. Just enough to feel it. Sweet, cool, real. A taste that had nothing to do with war. In the distance, an old friend approached. Carl, former mechanic, thin now, face lined with smoke and age. He nodded. "You came back." Hans handed him the Coke. "Want some?" Carl took it, smiled. They sat together in silence. Two men who had tried to outrun history and failed, but somehow survived it. Hans looked out over the wreckage, the forgotten jets, the children playing, and he felt something he hadn't in years. Not guilt, not rage, just clarity. The Me-262 had flown faster than bullets, faster than fear, but not faster than truth, and not faster than America. Hans never flew again. After the war, he worked in silence, fixing bicycles, then tractors. He never spoke of the Me-262, never showed his medals, never claimed his victories. In the village, he was just Herr Fey, the man with the limp, who always looked west when the wind picked up. Years later, in 1951, an American pilot visited Bavaria on a goodwill tour. He wore Ray-Bans and a bomber jacket, and spoke German with a Kentucky accent. At the edge of a quiet cafe, someone pointed him toward Hans. "You were Luftwaffe, yes?" Hans nodded. "A long time ago." The American smiled. "You guys built one hell of a jet." Hans looked down at his coffee. "We built speed," he said softly, "but you built everything else." The American left a small package on the table. Inside, a model airplane kit, P-51 Mustang, U.S. markings, wings intact. Under the lid, a note. "Freedom isn't fast, but it flies farther." Hans didn't speak for a while. He simply turned the box in his hands, stared at the image on the front. The same plane he'd once tried to shoot down. The same plane the children now flew with laughter. In the end, it wasn't a dogfight or a bomb that defeated him. It was a vending machine, a jazz record, a Coca-Cola bottle shared between enemies. He thought back to those final days in the cockpit, breaking the sound, chasing ghosts, believing that velocity could rewrite destiny. But war had taught him the last truth. You can outrun bullets. You cannot outrun ideas. What would you have done if you were him?